I love fantasy. I love the world building. I love the characters. I love the cultures that get added. I love the magical elements. Love the idea that the imagination is the limit with these sort of stories. Therefore, I've read quite a few. I've not read as many as people may think. I've not read full series. I don't think I've ever completed a series of anything in my life other than maybe Harry Potter. But I have started a lot of series, and therefore I have read a lot of fantasy books. I wanted to jump on and I want to show you some of my favourites that I've ever read. The first book is The Way of King by Brandon Sanderson. If you're a fantasy person, you've already read this. Shall I just get to the next book? No. So The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson is brilliant. Brandon Sanderson himself is a fantastic author. Almost everything he writes, I absolutely adore. Everything I've read of his, I think is fantastic. The Way of Kings is probably his magnum opus series. Now, I've not picked this up for quite a while now. So I've read this, I've read, so it's the Stormlight Archive series, but you can see here where my thumb is, I've read a few of them. In the UK, you can do like a part 1 and part 2. So this is part 1 of book 1, I've got part 2 of book 2. And then I've got The Words of Radiance, part 1 and 2. I think I've read Oathbringer, I've not read Rhythm of War. So I'm that far up, but they're brilliant. It's set in a very high fantasy world. There's knights, there's massive light swords, there's creatures that you've never heard of, there's areas that people have never explored. But the thing that Brandon Sanderson does so fantastically well is he always weaves these kind of twists at the end, or these kind of undertone of mystery, these higher powers into almost every story he has, where it makes you incredibly intrigued. And I don't know whether he does that intentionally, whether that's his kind of secret ingredient, as it were, into his books. But he manages to, as I said, weave in this element where you get to like the final 100 pages or the final 200 pages and things ramp up to a point where you're like, this is unbelievable. We're talking people who you have no idea how they have certain powers because nobody else has ever had that power just suddenly sneak in for a chapter, or somebody who's incredibly powerful is going through like a moral dilemma, all this sort of stuff, and it's really, really interesting. The Way of the Kings is magnum opus. I don't want to spoil any plot for you, but there's words in here such as Knight's Radiance, Shard Blades, Shard Plate. I can kind of read the book here. So it says, speak again the ancient oaths, life before death, strength before weakness, journey before destination, and return to men the shards they once bore. The Knight's Radiance must stand again. So it's been centuries since the fall of the 10 consecrated orders known as the Knight's Radiance. Mystical swords, suits of armour all remain, making for near invincible warriors. Men traded kingdoms for shard blades. Wars were fought for them and by them. And one such war is about to swallow up a soldier, a bright lord, a young woman, scholar. So brilliant. Love the series. The next book is actually the second book in the series of Darkness and Light by Ryan Cahill. Now, this series I imagine is going to be fantastic. For some reason I don't have the first book, which is Of Fire and Blood, I believe. But Ryan Cahill is a indie author. He has not done a lot of other work yet. He's got this series and he's got some novellas in the middle. Now I don't want to diss him by saying he's not done a lot of work yet, because to have written a book this thick, to have then written a sequel to this which is thicker by about 400 pages, his first book was about 600 pages, and to have written, I think, 2 novellas so far with a third on the way, in the space of, I think, like 2 or 3 years, is unbelievable. His fingers must be killing him from typing. Anyway, this follows, essentially the main story is about a boy called Caleb, and he essentially becomes embedded with a dragon. It's a bit of a plot spoiler because it's the end of book 1. So book 2 is what I'm highlighting for you here, but that's a bit of a book spoiler. The whole story is around that, so you kind of understand that and you can see it coming from page 1. The second one introduces some new characters, but opens the world a bit more and helps us understand a little bit more about what the big story is and what the big journey is and where Cahill's going here. So we're talking wars, we're talking cities that have never crumbled on the brink of crumbling, we're talking Kaelin's powers building to a point where people are starting to be like, I don't know how you're doing these things. There are more characters introduced, such as his sister. There's a really interesting character called Rist, who is his best friend, and there's this really, really fine thread at the moment where Rist is on the bad side, Caleb's on the good side, but Rist is only on the bad side because of the benefits of kind of literature, of learning of power, and it feels very, very kind of Star Wars-esque where, I don't know, Anakin went to the dark side to learn this power to become more powerful. And I can see this being a really, really important part of the plot. I hope I've not spoiled it too much for you there. I think there's still a lot more in here. When you've got a book that's 900 pages, I've not spoiled anything for you. I've given you the general theme. But that's the, I think it's called The Bound and the Broken series by Ryan Cahill. These are not cheap. Due to Ryan Hill being an indie author and not with the main publisher, you're probably looking at about 15 to 20 quid to pick up any of these books at the moment, but they are so worth it. Cahill's writing so open and so easy to understand. It's almost Brandon Sanderson-esque in how it's clever and it's well done, but it's not complicated like a lot of fancy books where you're reading some ye old tale. And his characters are generally interesting as well. They've got banter, they've got jokes, they actually have genuine conversations. Not all of them speak in some ye olde posh voice, but really interesting series, and would definitely recommend that alongside Sanderson. The next book is The Ember Blade by Chris Wooding. Now, The Ember Blade was one of my shock fantasy wins of all time. I picked this up and read it and listened to it at the same time and was really impressed, like utterly blown away by it. So without reading the whole plot, essentially a group of people are working in kind of like a slave mine sort of area, and then they rise up, and one of the guards that they rise up with rises up with them, and they go on a journey to find something. That's as much as I can give you really, to help conquer the bad people. Think kind of Lord of the Rings, going to an objective to help defeat a bigger enemy, that kind of element, and a group of people. What sets this apart is the comedy. There's a lot of comedy in it. It's not a comedy book, as it were, but there's some genuinely fantastic characters in here who I was like, I love that person, and at one point I thought they might have died, and they didn't, and that's brilliant because I love them and I want them to be in book 2, which I do have as well, which I'm really excited to read at some point this year. But the journey was really impressive. The world building was arguably maybe the weakest. It just wasn't something that I picked up on. There may be more of it in here, but what you've got to understand when you read books is you're not always going to pick up everything first time, but I'll probably pick up more in the second time. It tells the story of Aaron, and then the Ember Blade is the key to essentially solving everything, and that's why it's called the Ember Blade. But I was really impressed by this. Great journey, great writing, great characters, looking forward to more world building in the second half. And I think fancy books, I love pretty much all of them just because I love the idea of a fancy book. But this one I came out thinking, wow, that was genuinely fantastic. And I think I probably underrated it or underestimated it in a lot of my reviews and a lot of conversations I've had since. But the more I think about it, the more I talk about this one, the more I really want to jump into the Shadow Casket, which is the sequel. And so maybe I'll be doing that a lot sooner than I think I was going to be doing anyway. But that's The Ember Blade by Chris Wooding, the third book of the 6 I'm going to be showing you today. Have you heard of the Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan and kind of Brandon Sanderson? If you haven't, then this is the first book in the series. Now, I would say that the second book is possibly better, but I'm going to go with this book because this is more talking about the series as a whole. I know this title is books, but I wanted to talk about this as a series. So the Wheel of Time series is one of the most celebrated fantasy series of all time. I wouldn't say it's one of the best. I would say it's one of the most impressive. What essentially it is the first 2 or 3 books are really interesting. It tells the story of a boy who is a farmer, and he essentially goes on a journey to gain some power. He's got some special power that I think makes him the chosen one sort of thing. There's a massive dark enemy that's coming back that would essentially destroy the world if he wasn't there, and so him being there is a great thing. And it's a series that follows that story. Now, there are, I think, 14 books in the series, which is mental because these are not small books. This first one is over 700 pages long. I think the other ones are all 800 pages long. I think one of them might be over 1,000 pages long. They're all big, absolutely massive. But it's an epic. If you are one of those people who just loves to immerse themselves in a world, loves to sit down and read fantasy, then you're not going to find many better than the Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan. It's got everything you need. It's got fantastical creatures. It's got magical elements. It's got mysterious characters. It's got character deaths. It's got kind of big journeys. Loads of cities, some grander than others, little humble cities, a scary enemy, kind of like a cliche enemy called, I think they're called Trollocs, and they're essentially these like bull-like creatures that keep popping up all the time to kill people. It's brilliant. There are, now a caveat, if you're going to be reading the whole series, I am very well aware that some of the books in the middle, I'm not sure from when, maybe like 7, 8 onwards, are apparently very dull. They are not a lot happens, there's just a lot of him writing, that sort of thing. And then they pick up again, I think, when Brandon Sanderson picks them up. So what happened, unfortunately, is Robert Jordan died whilst writing the books, and Robert Jordan commissioned Brandon Sanderson to finish them, I think just before he died, or his wife wanted to commission them or something. Brandon Sanderson finished them, and apparently the ones that Brandon Sanderson wrote were brilliant. And I think Brandon Sanderson wrote them possibly before he did The Way of Kings. I'm not sure what his CV was at the time, but that essentially helped him get to become the author he is now. But The Eye of the World's fantastic. I think The Great Hunt, which is the second one, is fantastic. What else is there? The Dragon Reborn was brilliant. The Shadow Rising was okay. Then you've got The Fires of Heaven, which was, I think, mediocre, and then they get worse and then they get better. So that's what's happening there. But if you're a fantasy person, you've got to read this. The Eye of the World is a brilliant first book in the series. The Great Hunt will make you enjoy it even more. Now, this may be a book that you've not yet heard of. So this is Illborn by Daniel T. Jackson. I've talked about The Wheel of Time. I've talked about Brandon Sanderson, and they're probably two series you have heard of. This you may not have heard of. So Daniel T. Jackson is an indie author. I don't know if this is self-published because it does have a publisher icon down here, but essentially it's small. It's not your massive publisher company. It's not Gallant or something like that. Illborn tells the story of, I think it's 4 or 5 different characters who find out they've essentially got powers that they shouldn't have. Now, it's quite a slow burn through the first kind of 100, 200 pages or so, but really starts to ramp up. And the characters are really interesting. Their stories are really interesting. It's written essentially from different characters, not points of view, but you essentially one character you'll be reading about one, then you'll be reading about the next. Then they all start to come together. There is a sequel, which is also fantastic, so you don't need to worry about starting this and then the sequel being bad. That's brilliant as well, where they start to come together more, the characters start to change a little bit, so you want to think they're all good, but they may not all be good, these people with the powers. And it's really interesting, and their powers are, at the start I didn't think they were that well defined, but then they start to define themselves a lot more and you start to understand what their abilities are, which is really interesting. So that's Illborn by Daniel T. Jackson. Really, really interesting. Again, you've kind of got your journey, you've got your characters, you've got your cities, you've got your culture, you've got your interesting powers, you've got your history building, which is really good in a fantasy. So yeah, definitely recommend that one. And it's got a cool cover as well, and the sequel's got a cool cover. And also Daniel T. Jackson himself, I follow on social, interacted with a few times, is really, really sound, really, really good person. So I love making videos about authors who are actually good people as well, because then you want them to earn loads of money. Then the final book on my list is The Blade itself by Joe Abercrombie. Again, another cliche fantasy title. You've probably not been blown away by anything I've said today, but this is Joe Abercrombie. If you've not heard of Joe Abercrombie and you're a fantasy fan, he's kind of your grimdark, and grimdark essentially means a lot of killing, a lot of swearing, some sexual references, some dark humour. It's brilliant. It really, really is brilliant. He's got probably one of the greatest fantasy characters of all time in this, called Glocta, who we're supposed to believe is kind of a villain. He does some very nasty things, but he's also quite funny. He hates himself, but almost in a comedic way. He hates almost everyone else around him. He's utterly, utterly brilliant, and one of my, if not my favourite fantasy character of all time. And if you ever have had anybody talk about Joe Abercrombie and you say the words Glocta to them, they will say he's fantastic. He really, really is. So The Blade itself follows different characters. So we've got Inquisitor Glocta himself. He is crippled, one of his legs is broken. He was once a great war hero, and now he's kind of this crippled Inquisitor who essentially goes around torturing people, trying to find things out, that sort of stuff. We have Giselle Dunluther, who is a kind of a want-to-be army person. He says, paragon of selfishness is nothing more dangerous in mind than winning glory in the fencing circle, but war is brewing, and on the battlefields of the frozen north they fight by altogether bloodier rules. So I think he's kind of thinks he's it's like a celebrity who then has to realistically start battling, and things aren't as sexy as he thought they were going to be, or as easy and as pretty as they were going to be. And then we have Logan Ninefingers, who is maybe our main character, I don't know really, probably they're all kind of main characters. Infamous barbarian, finally run out of luck, caught up in one feud too many, he's about to become a dead barbarian, leaving nothing behind but bad songs and dead friends. So he's got a massive reputation for literally being unkillable. He's faced hundreds of people and come away with only one finger missing, and hence the 9 fingers. And it tells their stories. There's a war brewing. I think the weakest part of this is probably the plot, maybe. I got to the end and I was like, I don't really know what happened, but I very much enjoyed it. I think the sequels build on what's happening, and then there is a 3rd book as well. So I've read Before They're Hanged, which is the 2nd book in the series. Down that end, you can't quite see it. And then there is Last Argument of Kings, possibly, is the 3rd book in the series. So again, you've got another trilogy that you can finish, that if you want to start a new series, you've got the ability to do. So I definitely recommend doing that. So that is The Blade itself by Joe Abercrombie as well. Another fantastic fantasy book you should be looking into. Another one that you've probably heard of, Joe Abercrombie. Also funny on social. If you want to follow any authors on social, I definitely recommend following Joe Abercrombie. I keep wanting to say Brandon Sanderson, this is my brain. But anyway, yeah, that's the 6th book in this list I've got going for you. So they're the 6 fantasy books I would recommend. I think these are 6 of the best fantasy books I've possibly ever read. I will probably read more this year that I would add to this list. I have read some other big names such as The Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb. I didn't rate that as well. I think I'm going to give it a reread as recently people were telling me I need to reread it if I didn't think it was that good. Jonathan Strange and Miss Norrell by Susanna Clarke, which I also thought was brilliant but not as good as these. But yeah, there's some other fantasies I've read, but these were the best. You can see down here I read some John Gwynne as well. Whoa! Again, not sure if I'd rate those as highly as this. I think I need to give those a reread because I think a lot of people rate quite highly John Gwynne. Anyway, my little fingers are breaking because for some reason, at some point, fantasy became the thickest genre with the heaviest books. I don't know why. Let me know if you've read any of these books below. Let me know if you've liked them. Let me know if there's any other fantasy you think I should really be reading over these ones. Thank you for watching as always. Make sure you like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.